It is my really great pleasure to launch our event tonight. This is the third installment of Key Issues in Human Rights, a lecture and discussion series by William Schulz, who's this year's Richard and Ann Pozen Visiting Professor in Human Rights here at the University of Chicago. This is the third and final event in this series, and I want to take the occasion of this introduction to publicly thank Professor Schulz on behalf of the Human Rights Program in the University of Chicago for his term as our Pozen Visiting Professor. These Pozen professorships are a centerpiece of our annual human rights activities. And Professor Schulz now joins a remarkable roster of visitors who've graced us and informed our conversations about human rights over the last 4 years, and we really thank him for his work on our behalf. Now, of course, those of you who've already come to prior events in this public series already know who William Schulz is, and many of you know anyway, but that won't stop me. Professor Schulz has a long, varied, and successful career as an activist and as a theorist of human rights. Starting in 1994, William Schulz worked for more than 10 years eventually as executive director of Amnesty International, USA. During those 12 years at Amnesty, Dr. Schulz led the Amnesty International missions to Libya, Tunisia, Northern Ireland, and the Sudan. He has frequently been a spokesperson on human rights issues in public venues, on television, on radio. He's the author or contributing editor of several books, notably including In Our Own Best Interest, Tainted Legacy, 9/11 and the Ruin of Human Rights, The Phenomenon of Torture, which of course is the topic of his first lecture in the series, and The Future of Human Rights, U.S. Policy for a New Era. Professor Schulz is currently president and CEO of the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, which is a non-sectarian organization that advances human rights and social justice in the United States and around the world. He's also adjunct professor of public administration at the Wagner School of Public Service at New York University, and an affiliated professor at the Meadville Lombard Theological School here in Chicago. So you can see the range of his affiliations and works. As I've said, this is the third and final of our weekly series of public events with Professor Schulz, and the second and final lecture. On Tuesday, May 7th, here in this room, Professor Schulz discussed the question, is human dignity inherent? What torture has taught me? And I would say that he discussed it provocatively and astutely, given the vigor of the following discussion that night. And I think as I look around the room, I can see that many of you were here for that, so we'll be able to continue a conversation already begun, which is how it should be in these events. On Monday the 13th, I was not present, but I'm told that William Schulz led a lunchtime discussion that involved people from all over the city as well as the campus on current human rights challenges. And my hope is that he saved the best for last tonight. Time will tell. Tonight he discusses a topic of cardinal importance for any university human rights program, which is what human rights activists can learn from other social movements. William Schulz.
Thank you, Professor Kelly, and thanks to all of you, and a special thanks to Susan Zesch for hosting me here for this quarter. It's been a delight. I appreciate the opportunity last week to meet the Pozens and to get to know many of you. I hesitate to interrupt the repast here, aware as I am that some months ago when I was delivering the after-dinner speech at a large banquet, when the dessert was served, the moderator leaned it over to me and she said, Dr. Schulz, should I introduce you now or shall we let people go on enjoying themselves? So I hope you will find something to enjoy in addition to the food tonight. I went to Oberlin College at the height of the anti-Vietnam War movement. And at Oberlin, the principal focus of that movement was the military recruiters who came to campus every 6 months to seek candidates for ROTC. And one morning, as the recruiter drove into town, his car was suddenly swarmed and surrounded, brought to a standstill in the middle of the street by a group of 40 to 50 students. And for more than 4 hours, the recruiter sat in his car in his crisp uniform. The students chanted anti-war slogans. The recruiter would occasionally inch his car forward. The students would reposition themselves frantically to stop his movement. And then, after about 4 hours, something very human happened. The recruiter said that he had to go to the bathroom. Now, this was not something that the students had planned on. It threw them into a quandary. But because this was the era of participatory democracy, the students who were surrounding the car decided to take a vote. And by a close margin, it was decided that the officer could get out of the car and go to the bathroom, provided that he promised to return to captivity immediately after he had flushed. Naturally, the recruiter readily agreed. The students set him free. And 10 minutes later, the devastating news was transmitted by word of mouth to the students surrounding the now empty car. The recruiter has broken his promise. He had gone straight from the bathroom to the administration building and set up his recruiting table as he had intended to do 4 hours earlier. And with the recruiter free, the state police showed up, tear gassed the car, scattered the students, and safely drove the now liberated government property away. Now, I tell you this story because I have long found it one of the most amusing and telling examples of why the left wing often fails at political change. In the first place, the students had no plan. Not only no plan for a full bladder, but no coordinated plan for what to do with the recruiter and the car other than to hold them both indefinitely. This small incident of theater was not integrated into a larger strategy. And in the second place, the students had no adequate understanding of power. Here was a military officer trained in the ways of war, who represented what the students regarded as a morally bankrupt government that would stop at nothing, including killing children, to achieve its craven ends. And yet a majority of students thought that this officer would, for some reason, feel himself morally compelled to keep a promise. Surely forcing the officer to pee in a cup or to soil his pants would have been the tiniest of indignities compared to what he and his comrades were doing in Vietnam. The students had obviously never learned, or they had forgotten Frederick Douglass's famous words, "Power concedes nothing without a demand." It never did, and it never will. My observation from working with human rights activists for at least 30 years is that we are very good at some aspects of making change and very bad, or at least naive about others. And it's important that we human rights activists be as effective as we can be at making change because, as I said somewhat controversially 2 weeks ago in my lecture, human rights are whatever the international community says that they are. And so if we are to continue to expand the circle of those protected by human rights and to avoid regression, if we are to continue to be effective, we need to be smart. We need to be as smart about change as we are diligent, as disciplined as we are devoted. So what I want to do this evening is to see what the human rights movement has to learn from other social movements of both the left and the right. And of course I add the right because, as the political scientist Clifford Bob points out in his book, The Global Right Wing and the Clash of World Politics, the right, be it in the form of the NRA, the Tea Party, the Catholic Church, the Muslim Brotherhood, anti-gay rights activists, or any other, the right has appropriated techniques to promote their values just as surely as the left has. Now, we can all name successful movements for social change in something like chronological order. The abolitionist movement, the progressive movement, the conservation movement, the women's suffrage movement, civil rights movement, anti-torture movement, auto safety movement, women's equality movement, anti-apartheid movement, environmental movement, anti-tobacco movement, the campaign to ban landmines, the movement for LGBTQ rights, the disability rights movement, the marriage equality movement, and yes, to balance the ledger a bit, the movement to defend the right to bear arms. I call these movements successful, not because things like slavery or torture or smoking have disappeared, not because marriage equality is yet the law of the land everywhere, not because women's rights have been established. Women still earn only 77 cents for every dollar a man does, but I call them successful because the norms associated with all these causes have shifted fundamentally as a result of the movement's efforts. And the challenge today in all of these areas is to enforce compliance more than acquiescence to a value. No reputable person today publicly defends slavery or torture per se, or denies that smoking will kill you, or endorses public discrimination against women. That's why President George W. Bush, unlike his vice president, who long ago gave up any claim to reputability, twisted himself into knots to deny that his administration was torturing. It also helps to look at unsuccessful social movements. The Prohibition movement is probably the most obvious example, but I think a case can be made that the anti-Vietnam War movement was largely unsuccessful, because after all, the war lasted 6 more years beyond the time that Lyndon Johnson was driven from office. And indeed, on the day that that famous picture was taken at the American Embassy in Saigon of the helicopter lifting off the roof of the embassy, a majority of Americans still claimed that the Vietnam War was the morally correct thing to do. Despite all the blood that Daniel Berrigan and other religious people deposited on defense installations, despite all the hoopla that the anti-globalization activists have stirred up, the anti-nuclear, the anti-WTO movements, the Occupy movements, these can hardly be said to have triumphed. So what makes the difference between success and failure? First, most successful movements, at least at their outsets, have identifiable adversaries. It can be a person, LBJ or Bull Connor. It can be a government, the apartheid South African government. It can be a corporation, General Motors in the case of seatbelts, Philip Morris in the case of tobacco. But most successful movements find some entity or entities that personify the problem. The reason the anti-sweatshop movement was so successful in mobilizing campuses in the 1990s was that Phil Knight and Nike presented such an accessible target. And finding an appealing adversary is important for 2 reasons. First, because it simplifies the issue for that great mass of people who will never be devotees of the cause, but may well be sympathizers. And second, because if you can win against one president or one government or one corporation it sends a message to many others. Now, we human rights activists are pretty good at identifying adversaries, at railing against iniquity. It's much harder to do that when it comes to violations of social and economic rights, of course. Much harder to identify one adversary responsible for the denial, for example, of the right to public health. But nonetheless, we can find pretty good candidates in the form, for example, of insurance companies. We're pretty good at identifying adversaries, but we're not very good at the second characteristic of a successful agent of social change, because identifying adversaries is the easy part. That's what gets people hot under the collar and into the streets. But long-lasting change doesn't just happen in the streets, as witness the struggles going on now in Tunisia and Egypt to keep the values of the Arab Spring alive. What is considerably harder, but a second characteristic of most successful movements, is to find a common message with which to address that adversary and all that he or it represents. To find a message that will broaden the initial base of support and win sympathy from people who were initially indifferent or skeptical about the movement's goals. Sometimes that message is effectively encapsulated in a slogan. When you hear the following words, you'll, in each case, automatically associate them with a particular movement. Taxation without representation. Hell no, we won't go. What this country needs is more law and order. We're pro-life. We're pro-choice. Guns don't kill people, people kill people. The reason Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech was so powerful was not just because it was along with the Gettysburg Address, the finest public rhetoric ever delivered in the nation's history. It was because the message, the dream, that someday little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. The message was so simple, so congruent with the alleged ideals of the nation, so appealing to the consciences, especially of white people, so utterly justified that it immediately staked out common ground for widely diverse groups to occupy, and hence was almost universally compelling. Now, not every movement, of course, has a catchy slogan. None others, of course, had Martin Luther King Jr., but every successful movement manages to find a common message. Not wearing your seatbelt increases your odds of dying in an accident. Smoking will kill you. Find a common message and ways to transmit that message to a broad audience. Here is where the human rights movement often misses the mark. We confuse simplifying our message with compromising our principles, and so we are content to have human rights identified largely as a left-wing cause. Because human rights are so often framed in legal terms, because they derive from complex international instruments, because we rely so often on experts, because we tend to undervalue grassroots activism, we human rights practitioners often resist telling our story in dramatic terms for fear that it will taint our credibility. When Amnesty International was first founded, one of the requirements, the rules of the organization, was that it issue its reports in as uninspiring language as possible. And it succeeded. Now, this is ironic, inasmuch as the suffering that we seek to eliminate and the stories of its victims that we have to tell are full of drama, and it's self-defeating. Because though the general public can quickly draw the connection between its own self-interest and combating toxic waste, say, or achieving gender equity for our daughters, or reducing exposure to tobacco, it's easy to see the connection between my self-interest and all of those, but it's much harder to see the implications from my day-to-day life of poverty in Africa, or the treatment of prisoners in China. Sometimes we get it right. I think of First Lady Hillary Rodham Clinton's stirring proclamation at the 1995 Beijing Women's Conference that women's rights are human rights. But all too often we make it more difficult than it needs to be for a broader audience to identify with our cause. And why is that broad audience important? Because the third characteristic of successful movements is that they always operate on more than one level at once. They have multi-tiered strategies for confronting their adversaries and translating that compelling message into reality. Unfortunately, no one has put this better than Charles Koch, the principal financier of the Tea Party movement. This is what he said in the New Yorker a few years ago. To bring about social change, he said, requires a strategy that is vertically and horizontally integrated, spanning everything from idea creation to policy development to education to grassroots organization to lobbying to litigation to political action. And I would add corporate accountability, which of course Koch, who made his fortune in the oil business, conveniently omits. But his basic point is sound and simple, not simple to do, but simple to understand. Put in broad terms, it's not enough to change the laws if you don't change people's minds, and it's not enough to change people's minds if you don't change the laws. And yet, one progressive movement after the other, including the human rights movement, has failed to learn this lesson. The prohibition movement changed the laws, but not people's minds, or at least not their proclivities. The pro-choice movement changed the laws through the courts, but has failed to convince a sustainable majority of those laws' legitimacy, and so is constantly in danger of regression. The anti-Vietnam War movement, on the other hand, changed many people's minds about the war, but failed repeatedly to block appropriations or to win enough elections to actually stop the war. The civil rights movement did both. It changed people's minds, both those of the elite and the grassroots, which then changed the laws. And when the laws changed, more people complied with them, whether they liked them or not. And as more people complied, more people changed their minds. It created, in other words, a virtuous circle. As people were forced by law to sit beside people of other races in restaurants, for example, or to go to school with one another, setting aside the complicated question of busing, they gradually came to think, well, hell, this is not really all that bad. And when that happened, presto, we saw the emergence of a new norm. Southern segregationists were wrong about everything, but one thing they were indisputably wrong about was their oft-repeated slogan, "You can't legislate morality." But not only can you legislate morality, legislating morality is one of the major ways to change moral standards and hence to change behavior. Here's an example of how norms change. Every day for my 4 years of graduate school here at the University of Chicago community, I wore a pair of the most stunningly ghastly turquoise paisley pants you have ever seen. To my knowledge, though, not a single person looked at me askance. This was the 1970s. But why is it that not a single student would be caught dead in those pants today? How do fashions change? The answer is that first a small group of people change their minds about a particular fashion led by elites like fashion designers, but including grassroots people in key places like New York and LA, and then those new fashions get adopted by the popular media. New fashion laws are passed, if you will. And finally, larger numbers of people who don't want to be regarded as out of step with those laws, whose self-image is, I'm not a geek, then they start adopting those new fashions, and finally, turquoise paisley pants are relegated to my closet. And it's essentially the same way with social change. Once the new norms have been established, the laws passed, most people see themselves as law-abiding citizens and don't want to appear, at least, to be out of step or retrograde. Why do most people obey laws even though they know that they probably won't get caught if they don't? Why, for example, do most of us, 68% of us, wear seat belts even when we have little, if any, fear that we might be arrested for breaking the seatbelt laws? Well, one answer, of course, is that we know that wearing seatbelts may save our lives. But I'm old enough to remember when seatbelts were first installed in cars, and I remember quite clearly that for many years they sat unused, despite the fact that we all knew that using them was in our best interests. So what changed over the years such that the use of seatbelts today is almost pro forma? In 1954, the American Medical Association first called for the installation of lap belts in all automobiles. 1954. It was not until 1961, however, that New York State became the first state to require cars sold in that state to feature lap belts. And over the next 2 years, 22 states followed suit. And by 1965, all U.S. manufacturers, recognizing that a huge swath of their auto market would be off limits if they failed to install lap belts, almost all of them had complied. But featuring seat belts in cars and getting people to wear them were two quite different things. The first mandatory seat belt law was not adopted until New York State did so in 1984, almost 2 decades after the manufacturers had begun to carry the device as a matter of course. Did Americans really fail to understand for 19 years that wearing a seat belt increased their odds of surviving an auto accident? The truth is that it took almost 2 decades for the norms about seatbelt use to change sufficiently to overcome the resistance offered by the image of seatbelt wearers as sissies, plain old bad habits, misplaced defenses of personal liberty. No government is going to tell me to wear a seatbelt. And that change came about through a combination of education and law, dramatic advertisements, educational campaigns sponsored by citizens groups, Ad Council, others, about the ghastly consequences of failing to use seatbelts, came about because of a growing chorus of advice from opinion leaders and health professionals and driver's education teachers and insurance companies and parents, came about through legislation pushed by advocacy groups that both reinforced and required the use of seatbelts. And when seatbelt use became mandatory, a lot of people who hadn't been using them, but who thought of themselves as law-abiding citizens, began strapping themselves in because they didn't want to think of themselves as lawbreakers. And gradually, that practice became habitual for most people. Gradually, the mores of the society shifted, and it was no longer thought to be macho or cool not to wear seatbelts. It was thought to be stupid. And not just stupid, failure to wear seatbelts took on a social stigma. Think about how you regard a driver into whose car you get who fails to fasten his or her seatbelt. It took on a social stigma, and people who failed to wear them began to be thought of as bad citizens. And the result today is that a majority of Americans, 68%, use their seatbelts not because they fear the long arm of the law, but because they don't want to be thought of as either stupid or as scofflaws, a virtuous circle. And this point is reinforced by the fact that though only 68% of Americans actually wear seatbelts, 80% of Americans say that they wear their seatbelt. We're in the middle of a virtuous circle right now, as we know, with the movement for LGBTQ rights. It has been advanced at the level of legislation. The repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell advanced at the level of litigation, the California marriage equality case, most importantly, advanced at the grassroots. As more and more people have felt safe coming out of the closet, more and more straight people think, well, hell, this is really not all that bad. And regardless of what happens with the Supreme Court decision upcoming, it's inevitable that because the movement is operating on many different levels, not just one, within 10 or 20 years, open discrimination against LGBTQ people will be as unthinkable as open discrimination against African Americans or women is today. And what's the lesson for the human rights movement? The lesson is that it is not enough to work at only one level. It is not enough to rely on shaming, for example, but not litigation. It's not enough to work through the UN or the International Criminal Court, but to fail to work through the City Council or the PTA. It's not enough to do education, but to fail to do electoral work. There is no 501c4 affiliated with a large human rights organization. It's not enough to elect the right people, but not to press them to pass rights legislation, not to create grassroots coalitions. It's not enough to do legislation, but to ignore issues of corporate responsibility. Too often, the elites of the human rights movement have relied on one or two tactics at the expense of a comprehensive strategy. Fortunately, that is changing, prompted by the two most promising developments in the last decade of the human rights movement: the proliferation of indigenous grassroots human rights organizations around the world, and the explosion of new technologies at the service of those human rights activists. In virtually every country in the world today, even the most repressive, we find indigenous human rights organizations that were not there 10 or 15 years ago. Take Belarus, for example, one of the most repressive countries in the world, the last remaining embodiment of Stalinist repression, when 3,000 Belarusian human rights activists gathered on the main square in Minsk in 2011 to call for the resignation of the government. They did not make speeches. They knew they would immediately be arrested if they did. They simply clapped. Many people were arrested for clapping, and clapping in the main square was outlawed. But others returned shortly later, and this time they whistled. And they too were arrested, and yet undaunted, still others returned a week or so later, and this time they did not whistle. They had set their cell phone alarms to ring simultaneously at 8 a.m. to wake up the people. Human rights activists are everywhere. And the major reason for that, of course, is the proliferation of social media as a tool for human rights change. I don't need to describe the Twitter revolutions, but I do want to note that new technologies as instruments of human rights change are by no means limited to text messaging or internet organizing. Satellite imaging, for example, has offered protection to villages in Darfur by keeping them under surveillance at the height of the genocide there. Powerful data analysis techniques are marshaling evidence of atrocities used in the prosecution of everyone from Liberia's Charles Taylor to the recent conviction in Guatemala of former dictator Efrain Rios Montt. I'm proud to say that the little organization that I run, the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, funded for many years the medical forensic research on exhumed remains of those who were victims of the military massacres, blamed always, of course, on the guerrillas. Medical forensics, which proved definitively, introduced into Montt's trial, that it was indeed the military and not the guerrillas who were responsible for those deaths. In a 2010 issue of The New Yorker, Malcolm Gladwell argued that social networking tools like cell phones and text messages and Twitter are not nearly as important a medium of social change as their adherents are claiming. because he said they foster only weak connections between people, when in his view real activism requires strong ties, such as those who participated in the civil rights movement's lunch counter sit-ins exhibited. But as he so often does, Gladwell has oversimplified the issue. You certainly need brave elites to face the billy clubs and the fire hoses, but you also need hundreds of thousands of people to gather on the Washington Mall to hear that they have a dream and to elect politicians who will pass civil rights legislation. Unlike my fellow Oberlin students for whom that standoff with the recruiter was only a one-off encounter, a successful social movement incorporates all elements of a comprehensive strategy somewhere in the movement, and each group knows more or less what its role is. But having a comprehensive strategy is not enough if that strategy fails to satisfy the fourth characteristic of successful social movements, the other thing that the Oberlin students failed to do, and that is to reckon with the true nature of power. To make clear to the power holders not only what the ask is, but that there will be some kind of consequences of denying that ask. Successful movements are not violent, but they are not too polite either. To put it in a word, they are tough. They are not afraid to get in the way of power. And since we're in Chicago, I can only cite Saul Alinsky, who is still, for my money, the great master here. You may recall that when Alinsky's movement was making demands of the first Mayor Daley of Chicago without getting appreciable results, Alinsky decided to plan a shit-in at O'Hare Airport. He told the mayor that he was prepared to bring 2,500 poor people to the airport, having fed them baked beans, and have them occupy all the bathroom stalls in the terminals, so that when the business people and the tourists and the little kids came off the planes, they would not find a single bathroom that didn't have a long, long line of people hopping and jumping, waiting to occupy it. Well, Alinsky got what he wanted from the mayor. Police and military don't scare easily usually, but politicians and corporations do. Politicians and corporations are the easiest people to scare in the world, but only if activists remember Frederick Douglass's words, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has, and it never will. So, successful social movements can answer at least these four questions. First, who are the adversaries? Or to put it in another way, who are the power holders? Who are our real targets? Second, what is our common message? And are we expanding our base? Are we building alliances? In the face of our environmental crisis, such alliances between human rights activists and environmental organizations will be more crucial than ever. It's no coincidence that Rwanda had the highest population density per square mile in all of Africa at the time of the 1994 genocide. Similarly, the genocide in Darfur, Sudan was prompted in part by the fact that the encroaching desert in western Sudan began to gobble up pasture land that sedentary farming tribes had long drawn upon for their livelihood. For many years, these farmers had permitted tribes of herders to cross their lands with their goats and sheep, but as the farmers saw their land shrinking, they tried to put a stop to the grazing, which of course threatened the livelihood of the herders, and the result was a conflagration that claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, which the Sudanese government was more than too happy to facilitate. Climate change is not just a practical puzzle or an environmental problem, it's a full-fledged human rights challenge. So expanding those alliances, seeing the common ground between various movements, overcoming the temptation to siloize the human rights movement separate from so many others, that's a second challenge. Third, as a movement, are we operating on all cylinders or just a few? Do we have a comprehensive strategy? I have rarely seen a comprehensive human rights strategy. And fourth, what are we asking for? And have we made clear to those who can give it what the consequences will be of rejecting our demands? Every time there is a successful example of nonviolent strategic action, it is because the consequences have been made clear to the powerful. Once all of this has been brought together, there is, of course, still one more thing. Social change is iterative. It doesn't happen all at once. Small changes build on each other until finally the dayspring breaks and the shadows flee away. Above all, successful movements are patient and persistent. And that's the other thing that human rights activists need to remember, that it's a long journey to the promised land, but ultimately, if history is any measure, we will get there. If you don't believe that, read Kwame Apia's breathtaking book, The Honor Code, How Moral Revolutions Happen, in which he describes how dueling in Europe and foot binding in China, and yes, the African slave trade in the United Kingdom were each abolished by a combination of stigmatization and self-interest in the course of about 30 years, a short span in the entire spread of human history. Or read Tina Rosenberg's book, Join the Club, How Peer Pressure Can Transform the World, in which she describes how our connections with one another, facilitated, of course, by new tools for social networking, are doing everything from toppling dictators to reducing infant mortality. Well, perhaps it's just my nature, but when it comes to social change, I am an insufferable optimist. Shortly before I left Amnesty International, I had a conversation with a group of professors at Syracuse University in which someone asked whether over the course of the last 200 years, human rights had gotten better or worse. And with one exception, the professors all offered abstruse reasons why the human rights situation was worse today than it had been in 1806. And I listened to all of this for about 20 minutes, and finally, in my customarily tactful way, I said, "Are you folks nuts?" I said, "Why, just in the 12 years that I was with Amnesty, we've seen the creation of the International Criminal Court, war crimes tribunals for Rwanda, Bosnia, Sierra Leone, the Truth and Reconciliation process in South Africa following apartheid, the ruling by the British law lords in '99 that tyrants like Augusto Pinochet could be held responsible for their crimes on any country on earth that chooses to prosecute them. We've seen successful civil suits against torturers who've taken up residence in the United States. I started the Center for Justice and Accountability, which is every month, bringing those torturers to book. We've seen the Supreme Court rule the execution of juveniles and the mentally retarded as unconstitutional. And you don't think that we are better off than when a slaveholder, Thomas Jefferson, could get elected president? Now, you are academics, so you will realize that my rant made no difference at all to the conversation, but it made me feel better. And in fact, all of those folks were wrong. And to ensure that they stay wrong, however, requires us to be smart about how we organize for human rights change. F. Scott Fitzgerald famously said, "The world kills the very good, and the very gentle, and the very brave impartially. If you are none of these, you can be sure that it will kill you too, but there will be no special hurry." Our goal as human rights activists is to see that there is. Thank you. So, sure, yeah, thanks. So let's see who I've managed to offend this evening. Paul.
Bill, I'm wondering to what extent an essential element of the success might be an appeal to ego.
To ego?
For me, there was a brilliant article by Martin Wolf, the senior economist of the Financial Times, late last week, in which he lamented the failure of the climate change movement. And essentially, to boil it all down, he said, the movement has not been able to demonstrate what's in it for me today. What do you think?
Well,
maybe not necessarily climate change, but it's an element of the success of all of these.
Well, I think that your basic point is correct, Paul. If we think back to the early environmental movement, the successes were many times because there was a direct connection. I don't want my kids to be exposed to toxins in Love Canal. I don't want my kids growing up in a world where they can't breathe the air in the cities. And climate change is a bit more abstract a notion unless you travel to somewhat remote parts of the world. So I think, indeed, this book, I wrote a little book called In Our Own Best Interest, How Defending Human Rights Benefits Us All. And the point of that book was that there are very practical connections. That book was stimulated by an interview. I was being interviewed by a radio station in the hill country of Tennessee. And the interviewer said to me, well, now, Dr. Schulz, all of these things you've said about China and Burma and so on, and Congo, I'm sure that we all care about that, but what difference do they really make to me here in the hill country of Tennessee when I'm trying to eke out a living and send my kids to college and avoid unemployment and so on and so forth? And I wrote the book to try to answer that question. At the same time, that answer in and of itself is not enough. That self-interest answer, it has to be coupled with an emotional appeal as well for ultimate success. But it's certainly a part of that. Susan, did you run out to?
So I'm calling somebody else.
Oh, all right. Okay. Sure. Yes, sir.
So I was just curious. So how do you centralize a comprehensive strategy of human rights so you avoid, isolated acts of social engagement, or do you not centralize it, or does it are these just this is a social movement comes naturally?
No. Occasionally a social movement appears at least to come naturally. I suspect that there is almost always a lot more organizing beneath it, in the same way that it appeared as if Rosa Parks just one day felt tired and therefore we didn't want to go sit in the back of the bus, when we now know that she had been trained in that kind of action and fully intended to do what she was intending to do. But I think that the answer is you have to be very intentional about recognizing that your self-interest as an organization, each of us who head a human rights organization, that our ultimate self-interest is not well served by failing to engage with our colleagues in effective ways. That doesn't mean that we all do the same thing. It means that we map out those things that my organization does well and those things that your organization does well, and we create at least a complementary, if not a comprehensive strategy. It's a tough thing to do. After I left Amnesty, I served as a consultant to a funder named Humanity United, which is the principal funder of the anti-slavery and trafficking movement in this country. And Humanity United has put hundreds of thousands of dollars into forming the Alliance to End Slavery and Trafficking, which is a council of about 10, 12, 14 groups that work in this area, that meet every month, and that, at least theoretically, try to plot out a common strategy. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. It's tough. Yes?
So what I wanted to ask you to talk about, Bill, is how do you deal with this question of solidarity versus charity and motivations of some people to become involved in human rights work because it helps them affirm their own superiority to, those benighted souls who they're helping. Because part of our mission as an educational program is to try to bridge the sort of othering and to create empathy and to, I think it's a dilemma for a lot of human rights groups.
Absolutely, Susan. So, and I talk about it in terms of the dynamics of rescue. Because the dynamics of rescue, and I mean rescue in the broadest possible sense, but that is what human rights groups are trying to do. They are trying in some fashion to rescue people from human rights violations. And just as in our own lives, dynamics of rescue are very tricky, so they are in that context. Creates dynamics of indebtedness, creates dynamics of unacknowledged sense of superiority or virtue, maybe that's a better way to put it, unacknowledged sense of virtue that I have sacrificed to help you in this fashion. So I think it's a very, very tricky dynamic. And on the one hand, I don't really care what people's motivation are for being involved with human rights. Certainly at Amnesty, one of the most controversial issues was that the old-time Amnesty activists would say, a new activist would come in because they were Ethiopian, let's say, and they were concerned about what was happening in Ethiopia. Or maybe they were an LGBT person. They were concerned about violence against gay and lesbian people. And the old-time activists would say, you can't only care about Ethiopia. You've got to care about everybody equally. And I would say, are you nuts? Which I seem to say a good deal. I say, are you nuts? I mean, that's not the way most people come to any passion or movement. They come because they identify with those who are being mistreated in some fashion. And then, yes, as Richard Rorty so beautifully says in his essay Solidarity, then we tell stories about people with whom we're familiar, and our sympathies, our circle of sympathy and circle of solidarity gradually expands, and gradually we do come to care about others. But we start with that. I think it's a very tricky dynamic. Anything else of interest to you? Yes?
Well, as we think about these sort of four strategies that one would put together to work, what do you do about the fact that human rights language in the United States, as human rights language, never seems to have the kind of purchase that it does in other places in the world? So a problem can get framed in Ireland or in Africa or anywhere, and you say human rights and it mobilizes in some ways, or it makes something legible, that people understand that, or it's a way to build these sort of four things. Whereas in the United States, it gets evacuated. You know, there are rights questions going on all the time, but human rights hasn't tended to be the frame really since the 1940s by which a variety of social movements have thought that they could effectively make claims in a kind of American domestic system.
In fact, the truth is that human rights claims that to invest something with human rights language may be to doom it in the popular imagination. Why is that? Well, there are many reasons. One of them is fundamental American sense of exceptionalism, because you see, America's already taken care of the rights questions. We've already taken care of rights questions in the form of our Bill of Rights. We actually invented rights, quote unquote. And therefore, we have defined what rights are, and to the extent to which your human rights expand beyond or even contradict our definition of what rights are, we don't need to pay any attention to you. That's a piece of this. But another piece, I have to say, I return to one of my points, is that the human rights movement has largely allowed human rights to be claimed as a left-wing phenomenon. Now, there are certainly some prominent conservatives who will speak out about a certain range of human rights. When Amnesty International was founded, on its founding board was William F. Buckley Jr. Originally, because of course Amnesty always tried to balance its highlighting of violations in communist nations and violations in non-communist nations. Always tried to have a balance between those. So people like Buckley were very pleased with that. Who is the most ardent champion of human rights in the United States Congress? Well, there are two of them. One of them, of course, is Jim McGovern of Massachusetts, but the other one is probably Chris Smith, who is a right-wing, anti-abortion congressman from New Jersey. But when it comes to a whole slew of rights, Chris Smith is a very strong devotee of human rights, as long as it doesn't contradict his fundamental understanding of both American values and, in his terms, values of life. So I think that it is all caught up in that history and that self-image that we have in a way that Europeans certainly don't. In other parts of the world, of course, it has no purchase at all with the governments, but it has great purchase with the grassroots activists. And in this country, even the grassroots activists often fail to claim that human rights rubric or framework.
And I guess that's my question. There's this moment in the 1940s when progressive politics in this country, whether it was an African American struggle for civil rights, Japanese Americans, Native Americans, believed that a human rights frame connected back to the 48 Declaration actually was a way to go. And then, for complicated reasons, the Cold War, a whole big bunch of things, it's gone. But it never really comes back. I mean, maybe you can argue that the gay rights movement has used that language more than other groups. Indigenous rights groups have used it to some extent, but it's never come back as a kind of primary progressive language. And so, answering the question, well, it gets blamed on left-wingism, well, not really, because the left wing doesn't want to use it anyway.
Well, except, I mean, I think your example is very interesting. What is the major, most effective organization for LGBT rights? What does it call itself? It calls itself the Human Rights Campaign.
But some in the human rights world or some in the gay rights world would argue that that's the conservative moniker, in a sense that masks.
Well,
something
you know,
that might be easier for people to take.
A conservative moniker claims a broader ground. I mean, I think that is one of the fundamental flaws. When people who may regard themselves as conservative on some particular issues, economic, taxes, and so on, but who are fundamentally committed to other very important human rights values, cannot themselves feel comfortable within a human rights organization or community, I think it's not surprising that you're not going to frame an issue that will require a majority plus one, at least, or in the Senate, 60 votes or 61 for success. You're not going to put it in that language if the language has been so, if the connotation of the language is so highly charged politically. I think that's at least a piece of it.
You mentioned LGBTQ as a movement that has recently had a lot of success. Do you see any of the non-successful movements becoming that successful in the future?
You know, I think it's entirely conceivable that movements, for example, for the rights of the mentally disabled, let me just pick one just out of the air, animal rights movements. I think it's entirely conceivable that over the next, I don't know, you pick it, 15, 20, 25 years, that those movements too, after all, rights having to do with mental disabilities touch many, many people, many families. That's not at all an unusual thing. It's certainly come out of the closet in terms of people's greater willingness to own and to talk about mental illness. So I don't know, who knows? But I think it's entirely conceivable that there will be other successful movements. And I think there's a great deal to learn from the movement for gay and lesbian rights.
One of the public reasons advanced by the Bush administration to invade Iraq was, of course, that they were, making a big human rights intervention. How much damage do you think that does to the cause of human rights, or is it not that much of a concern?
Well, fortunately, in the case of the Bush administration, I think that they were very quickly disabused of their notion that they were champions of human rights because of their policies on the war related to the war on terror. So, in that case, I think we escaped. But you're absolutely right that that the United States has often justified its quote imperial overreach on the basis of human rights. The first President Bush did this too. In fact, he was aided and abetted by an erroneous report that Amnesty International issued shortly before the Persian Gulf War began, in which it claimed that the Iraqi soldiers were taking babies in incubators in Kuwait out of their incubators and killing them. That was a false report, but before it was revealed to be false, President Bush the first raised that report. That's the only time a Republican has ever liked a Amnesty International report, and waved it and said, this is what we're dealing with, this kind of. So I think that there's no question but what human rights often are in danger of being utilized for causes that we don't ourselves approve of. And we have to be as vigilant as we can be about that in clarifying when it is misused. So, all right, have we solved all the world's problems? Anita.
I just wanted you to say a little bit more about what you referred to as the explosion of the indigenous human rights organizations.
Well, I think that around the world, the human rights lexicon that we were discussing here, I think this gentleman is absolutely correct, that around the world, that lexicon has become very, very popular. It's seen as a framework with which to respond to repressive governments. It's seen as a way to claim an international imprimatur for groups that otherwise may see themselves at indeed are at distinct disadvantages in terms of power and visibility against a repressive state. So we've seen this. The Holocaust Museum did a fascinating survey of organizations that worked against genocide, and it came up with over 100 organizations that worked against genocide. The 6 out of the 10 largest of which had been founded in the last 10 years. There's been an enormous proliferation of these kinds of groups, and I think that is all to the good. I mean, there's to the extent to which this framework can be useful, particularly in highly repressive contexts, so much the better. Look at China. I mean, China can't begin to contain all of the human rights ferment that is going on within that state. It tries desperately, but it can't possibly begin to do it. So, yes.
I don't know if there are other questions as well, but this might be a suitable one to hold things together. Trying to connect the first talk and tonight's. And there's a puzzle that goes back to Mark's question on the consensus, the role of consensus in what are human rights and where they are. And I'm thinking through this disturbing combination of phenomena of the lack of a general preset public sympathy in the U.S. for a human rights argument. And we've got this best of times and worst of times. We've got an American public that are, for good grounds, you name, getting skeptical of what they're going to lose by signing up for a human rights argument against American exceptionalism, exacerbated by all the xenophobic fears of the time with real consequences like Guantanamo. But it seems to me that we have a fork in the road that your talk is leading us to. And that fork in the road is, do we push what will feel like a leftist agenda to insist upon sustaining our investment in human rights against resistance for things like Guantanamo, where we make human rights the banner? Or do we look for new banners on the grounds of comprehensive, coordinated strategy of effective? Do we become mobile and active and try out new slogans? Or is there something here in human rights that at the end of the day, and you can argue partly for our global connections, we really need to do the work of making the message available at the risk of it continuing to appear left-wing? See what I'm saying? There's a dilemma here.
Yes, there's a huge dilemma.
And what do you think?
Well, what I think is that at least for a certain set of rights, it is possible to continue to claim the human rights banner. I would never run away from that. But to frame the arguments, to frame the interests in ways that move beyond a traditional left-wing agenda. And I think, frankly, we're seeing it in the immigration debate today. After all, it is the corporate chieftains, many of them, who no one could claim are left-wingers, who are among the most ardent and passionate supporters, and not all just for practical reasons, sometimes because of their own experience with immigrant people. So I think that at least on some issues, we can frame these in ways that claim a larger constituency. I'm not talking, you know, about the nuts on the right wing, but you know, a larger constituency. Yeah, you mean a mainstream constituency. I'm not even asking for a conservative. I want a mainstream constituency. And on many of these issues, after all, human rights are born in good measure out of the American experience and the American ethos. And so certainly around civil and political rights, these ought to always gain a mainstream. And I think around a growing set of social and economic rights, though they would not be framed in those terms probably, but a growing set, there is that recognition as well. So I'm actually fairly hopeful, but I do think that the movement needs to be more sophisticated than it has been and more gracious than it has been in terms of recognizing that successful movements do modify their slogans and modify they don't modify their fundamental ideologies, not at all, but they do modify their presentation of those ideologies in ways that a larger tent can feel comfortable with. Well, Susan, thank you. I've had fun, and not just tonight, but all quarter, and I'm grateful to you. It's nice to see all of you. Please help yourselves to all of this magnificent food and wine, and enjoy Memorial Day.